Well, let me see. There's so many things to go into, but I think I'd like with respect to EPAM, my main question is, well, clearly it was a success that you're able to find this good model. But my question is, now people continue doing brain research for another 40 years. Does it correspond now to the way people think the brain? Today's researchers think the human brain works.
Really good question. Really good question. And this tape will be watched. This video will be watched by people 50 years from now, 100 years from now, who know the answer to that.
Right.
And so anything I say right now is going to look silly to them.
Wow.
But I just have to say what I think about that, because you've asked a super important question. The current run of brain studies, which are based largely on what's called fMRI data, functional MRI data, don't answer the question in any detail at all. They just talk about body energy being burned in one area of the brain versus another area of the brain. There's not a lot of detail involved in that. Mm-hmm. There is in physics, there are intermediate levels of theorizing that sit between what you might call the lowest or ultimate levels of theory building and the big picture. So, for example, when in college physics, we studied PV equals nRT. But we know that pressure is not just, it's not a fundamental in the world, it's a result of molecules banging up against a surface, which means it has something to do with molecules and statistical mechanics underneath. There's this intermediate level of theorizing. Well, all of us who were working on these things, like EPAM and GPS and so on, and for a long time what was considered the mainstream of AI, were working on a level of theorizing which I call the level of the mind, not the brain. And it was, therefore, the term giant brains like Ed Berkeley did, it was just offensive to those of us who were working in AI, because we were talking about symbolic processing in minds, not brains. And in fact, I even thought that it would be forever before there would be a connection between symbols and neurons and neuronal systems. Mm-hmm. When my daughter got to Oxford to study, she was in the neuropsychology DPhil program at Oxford. They thought because her last name was Feigenbaum that she knew something about neuropsychology. And they would ask, or an AI, and they would ask her questions like this. But actually, people like us, Newell and myself and Simon and 50 other people, or Minsky and lots of other, and even John Anderson, who was directly in psychology. He won the big prize in psychology. He was a student of Gordon Bowers and mine at Stanford. They were working at the mind level, like associative networks. John Anderson's thesis was HAM, Human Associative Network. Well, people recently have gotten enchanted with the idea that you could actually find out something about how the brain works. But it's very, very early in that. And they're making wild guesses and tremendous jumps without filling in the details. For example, in Newell and Simon's book, Human Problem Solving, they make a very strong case for a certain set of what they call EIPs, elementary information processes. Mm-hmm. And yet there has been no attempt to link EIPs with what's going on in the brain. If they could, then they could make a big jump between brain and problem solving.
Exactly. Okay. So, in fact, this it seems to me that even your 50 years from now might be an optimistic estimate as to whether people are going to understand cognition. It's such a mystery. But the more hardware we get, the more MRIs we get, the more tempted we are to think we're almost there. But you know, as you say, it's going to be a while before people know. But anyway, as far as anybody knows, the way EPAM works is still has some kind of physical manifestation, but it's not. But we can't nail it down and saying here's where.
Can't nail it down into brains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. Thank you. Now, another question before I forget. These people, I want to know something about working style. Like you mentioned, Newell would do a lot of programming and so on. Did they do a lot of their work, like Newell and Simon, or you and Simon and so on, in the same room over a period of time brainstorming, or was it more that you meet each other weekly and then go off and work intensively on your own? Or what?
Good question. For me, it was essentially working on EPAM anyway. Mm-hmm. It was working on my own during the week and then making sure to I got in a fairly long session with Herb Simon every Saturday morning. Herb would put away Saturday as the day to do sustained research and write papers. And so Saturday morning I could get some good time with Herb. But if odd things happened during the week, and either it was good or bad, I needed to talk to Herb to tell him something. Since we had in the Graduate School of Industrial Administration, the culture was a mix-it-up culture. And there was a very important event that happened every day at 3 o'clock where everybody, no matter what they were doing, just came down to the lounge and had coffee or tea. And
when you say everybody, this is 30 people?
Yeah, 40 people, the mathematical economists, the students, the graduate students, not the undergrads, they didn't, or the master's students, they didn't. It was the research-oriented people would just flood the commons room, and then occasionally we'd have speakers come in from the outside, friends of Simon's or Bach's or whoever giving, George Danzig might show up and talk about his thing.
Were you able to recreate that later on when you were running labs?
We never did it in computer science. We talked about it a lot with Bob Floyd when the building was being planned about spaces in which that could happen, and it never quite came off. And then in the new building, really nothing like that happens.
Well, maybe people hearing this oral history will pick up on it then again, because it certainly worked. We know a lot of examples where it worked, but you're right. Now people are it's so much less personal, less interactive between the different flavors of the field as things are getting more complicated.
Now, just a footnote to what you just asked. Newell would see Simon. Newell had more access to Herb than I did, because he's more senior than I was, way more senior. But Newell worked mostly at home and on his teletype with Cliff Shaw. So he'd come in a couple times a week to talk to Herb, but he wouldn't show up at these 3 o'clock things because it was an extra trip for him from home.
He's really on a teletype to Los Angeles?
Yeah.
Rand
gave him a teletype.
Before. Yeah, no,
person-to-person teletype.
I was in, Cleveland, Ohio at that time, but I never heard of anybody, running, communicating with another, except for you'd send telegrams, when you'd get these funny paper things. But that's wonderful.
Well, remember, they were operating on Air Force money. Project Rand was a big deal, Air Force contract.
Okay, because, they didn't have time sharing at MIT until a lot later.
Yeah, this was person to person. This wasn't person to computer.
Yeah, okay. Very good. Now, so then I guess we should start moving into why you get to Cambridge during 1959.
Yeah, I want to back up just 1 second before you do that. To say two last things about EPAM. The first is that it was the source of my first significant aha moment in my whole scientific life, which is the following. Herb and I were working on the assumptions that we were building into this learning model. And I want to emphasize learning model, acquisition, putting things into memory, building branches of this tree. And I was running experiments, and I would literally run them on the computer. I would run literally me sitting on the 650, and I'd run in cards, and they were just simulating a psychological experiment. So it was literally running it. And then one day, I'm running some of these, and we wanted minimal assumptions. We didn't want a bell and whistle theory. So minimal assumptions. So we're pruning everything to the minimal, and I'm putting this stuff in, and this program, this simulation is learning some stuff. Oh, trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, trial 4, it forgets it. Trial 5, it's back. Trial 6, it's gone. 7, 8, it's there. 9, it's gone. What is going on? I mean, is that a bug in the program, or is that... Well, it turns out it's not a bug in the program. It's this minimalist assumption that you never should store more than you need for access at any moment. In other words, recognition is different than recall. So if you want to access something in a recognition state, recognition mode, you store a small amount of information about it. But the more you learn, the less adequate becomes that information. So all of a sudden, the access to it disappears. Well, you have to relearn that by adding a little more information. And you relearn it, you only need to put in a little more information, and you can relearn it in the very same trial. So it comes back right away. Well, it turns out that's an exact match to the psychological phenomena. That you do have this thing called interference forgetting, and the marvelous thing about interference forgetting is they come back right away, and then they disappear again, and they come back right away. So that was an amazing thing, because I never put in any assumptions about forgetting at all. It just dropped out of the theory, which I loved.
Exactly. That's great.
And that's the second thing I want to say about EPAM is that Herb worked on it until the time he died. It was on his list. He had a list of the 10 books he was working on, literally. And on that list was EPAM. He had still been working on it with a student named Howard Richman. He and Howard had published a lot of papers. They had programmed IPL5 for the PC. They had by that time it was EPAM, they had evolved into EPAM 6. And it was running on the PC via IPL5. And it got very much more extensive. But by the time it was finished, well, even when I left it, I didn't do much more work on it after 1965, but even when I left it, it was the best going theory in that verbal learning area that there was in psychology. And it still is.
Is there a Java applet that, or it's not, we can't easily just try it out on some website right now?
No,
Well,
not on some. I actually
let's
just
hope
recently donated some floppy disks to the Computer History Museum that I think had EPAM running on IPL5 for the PC, but I could be wrong. But we can get it from Howard Richman.
Well, okay. So there are ways now to simulate simulators of the past, which is great. Now then, you got your thesis in hand, but before you graduated, you spent a year abroad.
Well, I finished my orals in some morning in September in 1959. Herb's view was a thesis should take 3 years, and I tried to get that through at Stanford, but and that happened with Doug Lennett, and it happened with Ted Shortlift, but very few others finished in 3 years. But I took my orals in a morning of some September morning in 1959, and in the flew to New York, and in the afternoon got on the SS United States boat to go to England on my Fulbright. But Carnegie Mellon didn't award degrees in September; they only award them in June. So, although the work was done, the degree was awarded in June of 1960. And then, but meanwhile, I was off in England, and I never showed up for my actual graduation because I was off in Russia.
Right. Yeah, I was wondering about that because I knew airplane travel was not very common to go to across the Atlantic at that time. So, but did the Fulbright program is only about 10 years old at that time. Is it are there lots of is it already a real big program, or are there very few Americans who are getting Fulbright grants?
Let me give that some thought. I'm guessing to say that the number of Americans that showed up going to England was, this is a rough guess, I'll say 20 plus or minus 10.
This would be in all fields, including agriculture?
Oh, yeah. So one of my, in fact, it's interesting, one of my friends at the time was one of the, Nancy Andreasen, who was an English major at the time, was going to do English at Oxford. She ended up being one of these neuroscientists that we're talking about, who's written books on the brain in her subsequent academic career. And one of my friends from Carnegie Mellon was a Fulbright scholar, Dave Hummer. He ended up heading the joint laboratory of the astrophysics lab at Colorado.
So, did you have a choice of many places to
Yes.
To visit?
Well,
I mean,
you mean to stay at?
Yeah, I mean, you say.
I could have had my pick, but
Yeah.
I picked NPL because as they would have said in Casablanca, I was misinformed. The NPL, National Physical Lab, had hosted what is essentially, except for the Dartmouth workshop, it was the first big public AI conference.
International, yeah.
1958. It's called the Mechanization of Thought Processes. Albert Utley was the director of the lab, and he ran the conference. I took that as a sign that they were active in this area. And that's why I chose them, and it was in the London area, and that would satisfy my need to be around concerts and plays and et cetera. I didn't even think of Cambridge. But actually, the real good stuff in the country was going on at Cambridge and Manchester, not at...
Right. Okay.
And NPL was great, I guess, when Turing was there.
Now, what about like Edinburgh?
Oh, came way later. That was Donald Mickey's creation.
I see, much later.
Oh, much later. That was when Donald Mickey, who started out his academic life as a geneticist, gradually, and was working for Turing in the Bletchley Park show and worked on Colossus. That's when he gradually made this transition into AI and eventually showed up at Edinburgh to start a lab.
So I've never been to NPL, but you say it's near London.
Yeah, it's it's about 10 miles beyond the end of the Green Line. The Green Line ends at Richmond, and you keep going on in the direction of the Hampton Court Palace, and you go right through Teddington.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I guess I did visit. Okay, and of course, Cambridge is to the north a ways. So you didn't spend much time at NPL, but you went up.
Well, I'd go there every day. I bought myself a little Volkswagen, picked up at the factory in Germany for the amazing price of $1,100. Can you believe? And
Let's see.
brand new Volkswagen, and I would drive down from Richmond, where I lived. I lived on the end of the line, so I could take the train into London when I wanted to, and drive to the lab when I needed to. I went there every day, but I can describe to you in great detail why it was so dull. I'm sure. I know it isn't dull, because Wilkinson did his wonderful work there, and Donald Davies did that incredible work that he never gets credit for on the birth of packet switching and internet ideas. We Americans just never give Davies credit, but he did it there. But it seemed really, really, really dull. When I got there at NPL, having come from an environment where I was programming on the 709, and we had everything we needed in terms of printers and card punches and blah, blah, blah. They still were punching cards on what we would call binary correction, one at a time. So if you had to do a character with needed 2 punches, you had this one card in there, and you had to move it there and punch it there, and move it there and punch it there, and this is ridiculous. And this is 1959.
And then submit it to the operator, as you said. Yeah.
So I happened to make contact with, I think the original contact came from Roger Needham, although it may have come from his wife Karen Spark Jones. But anyway, they knew that I knew about list processing. They also knew that I knew about compilers because I had come from Perlis's place. So they wanted to make contact with an American who knew about these things. And so the first time we met was when Roger and Karen came down from Cambridge to NPL. But they were such great people that, and Karen introduced me to Margaret Masterman, who was the head of her language research unit, and Margaret introduced me to her husband, who was a philosopher, and it was a great scene. So I spent a lot of time with them.
There's this atomic energy lab. Is that not connected with?
Nothing.
No connect, because that's where Glennie was. He was doing compilers. You never met Alec Glennie?
Never.
By the way, I can say that the conditions were even worse at Caltech in 1960 when I got there as a graduate student. Not only, I mean, I don't think we had punch cards, we had paper tape, but it was really hard to use the computers there. So it was like that all around the world, you know, in spite of the fact that you're spoiled by having worked at Rand and so on. All right, now, but you told me once that you wished you hadn't graduated so soon?
Oh, yeah, good point. So I spent a year in England, and the high point of my year was meeting Karen and Roger and having a good time, traveling around the continent, etc. But what I realized was,
I just want to get it straight. You also went to Cambridge a few times?
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
But not very often. Okay, fine.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I would either drive there or take the train up.
Okay, thanks.
Mostly there was just more there than for Roger and Karen coming down to NPL. I could see a lot of other people there. But well, I realized later in life that what I needed to learn from Herb Simon, now we're talking about one of the great scholars of all time and a genius. And I was just lucky enough, by pure accident, to get into orbit around Herb. It was just stupid to leave after 3 years, even though Herb thought a 3-year degree was what you should get, but he offered me a postdoc. I could have stayed there as a postdoc. Actually, I think the offer was like a 2-year postdoc. But I was sort of wanted to see the world. I hadn't been out of the United States except to a little trip to Canada, and I had gotten married by the time my wife wanted to travel also, and it didn't seem like what I wanted to do was just do more sitting around doing EPAN. So we traveled, but in retrospect, I just had a lot more to learn from Herb about the processes of doing science, what I call the heuristics of doing science, just how that's why I strongly believe that the PhD is a research training apprenticeship. Then you have to be around the person doing the research and absorb what they do.
Well, but you came out okay. I mean, what would you really, you would have put the rest of your life on hold for another year?
Yeah,
and you think it would have been even better then?
I think it would have been better to skip the England experience and spend it with her.
But the international, the idea of, I mean, later on you become a world traveler if you make all these connections.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
You're building up more paradigms in your head for dealing with, learning about organizations and different lifestyles. You have to say, well, if I had more of this, what would I take away?
So, that's right.
But,
that's right.
But it's good to get your gut feeling about this. But of course, there's all kinds of things in our life we would wish we had another year to do this and another year to do that. Yeah. But then you decided not to do a postdoc because you wanted to, because you're still like variety and challenges of new things. And so now your first job then.
So I had arranged my first job before going off to England.
Mm-hmm.
I knew what it was going to be. I had traveled, after high school, I traveled around the country and decided, San Francisco Bay Area, that's where I want to live. And that meant I had two choices, Berkeley or Stanford. And,
Sorry, the first choice is academia or not academia.
oh, yeah.
So
Actually,
somehow you decided you also wanted to be involved with teaching, or.
Okay, so, good point. Don, you are so smart.
No.
Good point. In 1956, when my parents were still thinking I'd be an engineer and go out and get a job and earn some money, I actually interviewed at Raytheon in Palo Alto. There is no Raytheon now, but it's on the other side of Bayshore, and there was a big plant. It was Raytheon. And but I knew I wasn't going to do that. I knew I was going to be a graduate student. I mean, it was the spring, but I had already decided to go academic. Well, as an academic, you could go to a research lab or you could go to a university, and I guess I even saw in Al Newell a person who had chosen research lab at that time. Newell eventually switched from Rand to Carnegie Mellon, but Herb Simon was such a strong influence that it literally didn't enter my mind to go to a research lab. So I never even searched for that. And when I was searching for a job, as usual, you go to your advisor, and I told him I wanted to go to the Bay Area. Could he work anything at Berkeley or Stanford? First thing he did was to say Stanford, and he wrote to Pat Suppies and said, Pat, can you, I have this great student, can you get him into the psychology department? That's where he belongs. And Pat wrote back and said, no, we don't want him. More or less. I never saw that exchange of correspondence, but there were people who loved me, and that was at a new research group that was being started in the Berkeley Business School. They had a kind of Carnegie Tech envy. They were going to bring in mathematical, they had one guy who, now when I did that economic simulation with March and Sayert, we thought Sayert, March, and I thought we were the first, but it turned out we were not. We were the second. And the guy who was the first was Austin Hoggett. He had done it at IBM, but he had ended up at this new lab at Berkeley. Okay. And then Wes Churchman, the operations research guy, who was also a philosopher, who was also interested in models of mind, he ended up, because of his operations research background, he ended up at that lab. And another mathematical economist named Fred Balderston, who later became one of the vice presidents of the statewide University of California, was there. And they really wanted us. They really wanted people who represented that Herb Simon flow. So they offered both of us jobs.
And they're running a graduate program.
Yeah. And a master's program and an undergraduate.
So how many people?
A big business school.
FTEs?
Oh, I don't know. That was a big business school.
Okay.
But in the management science lab, maybe Hoggett, Balderston, Churchman, Julian, myself, maybe 6 FTEs.
I see.
all
Julian
told.
Feldman was already there.
Yeah, Julian Feldman. He didn't go to England. He didn't do anything except go there and get a job. He had a family. He had to earn money.
Now, what kind of computers did they have at Berkeley?
Berkeley had by that time, they had a 7090, I think.
This is 1960.
I got there in September 1960. I believe it was a 7090 by that time. I think the 709 era had ended. It was over in the math building.
Okay.
And
I guess Lamer inherited that.
Yeah,
machine
that's right. That's right.
in later years. So did they allow you to touch the machine?
No. No, so, but something happened right away that was, or not right away, but within that period of time I was at Berkeley, something miraculous happened. It's called the PDP-5.
Uh-huh.
All of a sudden, there was a thing called a mini computer, and it was cheap enough that people with research grants could actually buy one and just stick it in your lab. And so toward the end of my stay at Berkeley, we actually had our own computer.
So PDP-5 already by that time, not 1.
We never could have, I heard of PDP-1, but that, PDP-1 was like a $100,000 computer.
I see.
And I think the PDP-5 was down in the $35,000
I see.
range, something like that.
Interesting, yeah, which is still a huge amount.
But anyway,
Considering the-
computing was not a great experience at
And
Berkeley.
the faculty salary would be something like $10,000 or
No,
something?
I started at Berkeley. They started me at assistant professor step 2 because they couldn't, the salary level was not high enough at step 1, so they put me in at step 2, which sort of saved me 2 years on the tenure track. And it was $7,600 for a 9-month year. And then I would work at Rand in the summer.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Yeah. And so you're teaching graduate students or mostly doing research there or?
No, I was teaching. I had a full load, or whatever the full load minus credits for research grants that you get. I had one grant from a private foundation that Herb Simon had recommended to this the private foundation had come to Herb saying, we want to get into the area you're doing. Who are the smart people around the country? Herb told them about me and Julian, and they gave us some money there. And then Licklider came around may have been 63 or something like that. Basically, on the same route, he talked to Herb and Al. He knew them from way back because of the psychology connections, and came there and said, okay, in Berkeley, I want to sponsor AI research, and I'll give that money to Feigenbaum, and I want to do a medium-sized time-sharing machine that is not PDP-1 time-sharing and not Project Mac, but something in the middle. Turned out to be, we bought the SDS 930, and I'll give that money to Harry Husky, and Harry and I were the co-PIs of that project.
Is Harry in the same department?
What?
It's Harry Husky, is
No,
he?
Harry was in double E.
He's in electrical engineering, okay. And we might as well, while I'm thinking about it, you and Harry were the co-advisors to Niklaus Wirth
Yes.
at this time?
Harry was the main advisor, and I was the second reader.
Uh-huh.
I'm very proud of that. Nobody knows that.
Well, that's why I wanted to bring it up.
That's why I want to go photograph Klaus's front page.
Yeah. Well,
But, and then, there's a lot of discussions going on between Forsyth and us. Us partly because he knew Harry really well, and partly because he was interested in getting me at Stanford via McCarthy's recommendation. So Klaus.
That's my
came
next
down.
question you anticipated, because George was really, in my opinion, he saw that, we're going to have someday computer science departments and not just, branches of economics departments and mathematics departments. And so he was finding the best talent all over the world, and I figured that he might not have pestered you while you were in England, but he probably did as soon as you got to Berkeley.
Well,
So-
actually, he didn't. It wasn't until 1964. My moving from Berkeley was a function of two things. There was a push and a pull. The push was that because of that early coming in at step 2, I was coming up very early for tenure, and the business school faculty as a whole, it's a big faculty, maybe 50 people all told, they couldn't figure out what to make of a guy who is publishing papers in computer journals, artificial intelligence, psychology, is a member of the Institute for Human Learning at Berkeley. What is this guy? Is he a business guy? So they hemmed and hawed on the promotion to tenure. By that I mean months instead of weeks. And so that triggered me to search. Look around, what are my alternatives? Well, at that point, I had to make a real life decision, a major life decision. Am I going to search in psychology or am I going to search in computer science? And I did both. And while I was doing the search in computer science, McCarthy, that's the pull, is McCarthy. I knew John through AI stuff and AI work, and John told Forsyth that there was this good guy across the bay.
I see. So, I guess I misread that timeline a little bit there then. But you did get the associate professor at Berkeley.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
But you were 20, I don't know, 27 or something, anyway.
1960, that was
Yeah.
in the middle, by the summer of 64, I was associate professor there, so
Yeah.
whatever
Right,
that
so-
is, 28.
Yeah, so 28, so that's still, could also account for a little bit of hesitation on their part. Now, but you were advising people like Worth, who were doing, his thesis was about compilers.
Yeah.
And so you're also
Oh,
training students in computer science, even though.
yeah, I had way
even though
more
you're in a
fun
business.
than that,
Yeah.
because Harry took off, just when we got our money, Harry took off for India on a year sabbatical. And Dave Evans Dave had just come to Berkeley. Harry had hired him from Bendix. He had just become a faculty member at Berkeley, and Dave took over from Harry. And I learned more computer engineering from Dave Evans in 1 year. Since I was PI, I got to sit in on all these meetings and help pick which machine we're going to go down the road
This is like
for.
Evans and Sutherland?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Dave Evans, the
Yeah.
designer of the Bendix G20. And,
Yeah.
fantastic engineer. I learned what engineering was all about.
I see.
How you could actually compute things and
So
make.
are you in Corey Hall or wherever, I mean, are you in the same
No,
building? as-
I was in the business school was in a historic, wonderful old Victorian building called South Hall. And my office was above Wheeler Auditorium,
Oh,
if you know that,
yeah, okay.
right behind South Hall.
Okay.
And those guys were over in Corey.
So at Berkeley, I know that you introduced at least one new course in their curriculum, and that was something about artificial intelligence, possibly other ones. But can you tell something about the teaching at Berkeley that was most innovative?
Most innovative, wow. Okay, just two things occur to me about the teaching process that Julian and I were using there, and it could be that I inherited it partly from Herb Simon, or I'm not sure. But anyway, there was no established literature of the field of AI at the time, but there were a couple dozen, maybe twice that number, of illuminating things to read. And some of those, Julian and I...
Julian Feldman. Sorry, this is Julian Feldman.
Julian Feldman, yes, who was a graduate student colleague of mine at Carnegie Tech and came to teach at Berkeley. Jerry Feldman was another colleague of mine here at Stanford for a while, and everyone confuses Jerry with Julian.
Right.
But so we were teaching from selected papers from the literature, like, for example, that logic theorist paper I was telling you about before that was in the IEEE proceedings of information theory, or my paper on EPAM that was from the Western Joint Computer Conference. So these things were all over the place. They were appearing in a broad array of publication media, journals and so on.
Right, the ideas came out before their time, so there wasn't a natural place to publish any of them.
Right, right.
And you're teaching this you're co-teaching this with him as a course? Is it an elective course, or is it a seminar series?
Oh, it was surely an elective course. I mean, I don't remember the details of it, but I can't imagine in a business school it would be anything else but that. But it was offered to all of Berkeley, not just to the business school, because that's where I was going to get my best students. We're going to come from the math department or the double E or so all these papers were, I guess we copied them and put them on loan at the library, and the students would run off to the library and read the papers. I guess they could take them out overnight or something, but they didn't have a lot of time to spend with them. So Julian and I decided that, the time was right for a book that would bring all this together. Really writing a book is hard work and takes a long time, as you have demonstrated in your life. So what we did was a collection, an edited collection. And that was, and we picked, these were the papers we were using in our courses, except for a few oddities. Like, there was one paper in that book on Soviet, what the Soviets were calling cybernetics, but was really computer science. And that was only because it was a hot topic of the time, not because it was something I was teaching in the course. But most of it was what we were teaching in the course.
If my memory is correct, Xerox machines were quite rare at that time.
I don't know how we made
At Caltech, I had to go several buildings away to use a Xerox machine once in a while. I mean, like 1962 or so.
Yeah, you're right. And I don't remember, when I said copy machine, I was really nervous about saying that because I wasn't sure that there were even copy machines at the time.
Yeah, right, we had these chemical things that smelled funny and so on.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly how the library made the copies of it, but so we put this book together with an introduction, which I wrote. And actually that introduction has been very, it's had a long life in AI, and it's referred to a lot by people that, gee, that kind of thing, that what you said there really brought me into the field. And then it had interstitial material between the papers to kind of tie them together so that the student would know how one led to the other or what relationship one of these papers had with another. And we took this manuscript we sent it to the editor of the Prentice Hall series of something. Now, why Prentice Hall? First of all, Prentice Hall was used to publishing things from people in business schools. But more important than that, the editor of the series was Herb Simon.
Oh, okay.
So we sent it to Herb Simon and said, publish this.
Oh, I see.
And he advised Prentice Hall not to do it, that there wouldn't be a market for it.
Oh.
And
he's a business, he knows everything about economics, right?
Yeah.
Nobel laureate.
Like Einstein said about the cosmological constant, Herb used to say that was the worst mistake of his career.
Okay.
But anyway, it was published, and it was highly influential.
But it was published by Prentice Hall or McGraw-Hill?
No, it was published by another publisher, McGraw-Hill.
Yeah.
And then I subsequently became the
editor for McGraw-Hill.
Editor of McGraw-Hill Computer Science Series.
Mm-hmm. This book is, I don't know if we mentioned it, Computers in Thought.
Computers in Thought is the name of the book.
It's not called Computers as Brains.
No.
Exactly.
Oh,
You were saying you didn't like
that's right.
the people characterizing them as giant brains.
We were modeling thinking. We weren't modeling brains.
Exactly.
Now, what else do I want to say about Computers in Thought? Because it was a collection, it became a kind of a nightmare as far as intellectual property rights and royalties. So we made a proposal to the authors, Newell, Simon, Selfridge, Minsky, et cetera. Said, look, no one's going to get very much money out of this book if we distribute the royalties. How about we take all the royalties and make a prize? And we established the Computers in Thought Award of IJCAI, and it's still given today. It's given to, we established it as being for young people. At one point, it was kind of like the best thesis in the last 2 years. Winograd won that, for example, for his Scherzer work. Leonard won it for his work.
In 1963-4 was there Association for Artificial Intelligence?
No, it was
already established?
just beginning an international conference called ICHCAI that took place every 2
I
years.
see, the conference was had some kind of a bank account
Yeah,
or
right.
organized as a
Right.
entity. It's a very brilliant, foresighted idea, I must say. So as you and Stuart are working on it together, how do you share the work?
Julian and I?
I mean, Julian. What did I say, Stuart?
I don't know what you said.
I'm thinking Stuart film. I'm thinking cognitive psychology. I'm sorry. I'm all confused here with my cognition.
I have only a misty recollection of it, except that I volunteered to write that introduction because I think both of us felt that I was more inclined to do writing than he was, and that I would be able to cover the AI side of things as opposed to the human cognition end of things. And so I wrote that introduction, and I guess maybe Julian wrote those interstitial material items and made sure that the book was packaged right. But the person who really did the work, as it turns out, was a person you know real well, Joe Traub's wife, Pamela McCorder.
Oh.
She was my secretary at the time. Julian's my secretary.
She was at Berkeley then.
She was at Berkeley. She was a
I see,
junior.
because she came to
We hired her
Stanford.
when she was a junior in undergraduate.
Oh, okay.
She worked for us straight through. Then she went to BART for a while and then came to Stanford to work for me here. And then went to graduate school in writing.
And wrote novels like this person that you were working with at Carnegie. Yeah. Okay. So that's your first of what turned out to be quite a few books in future years. Now, so let's go on to the next phase of your life. Then you got tenure at Berkeley in the business school, but then at the same time you started looking around, and you said you had a choice point, but you had the idea that computer science would be an existing entity of the future to be part of, or something like that. But did you say you had a choice?
Yeah, Don, let me explain.
Yeah.
Okay, the choice was, do I want to be a psychologist for the rest of my
That's a
life,
psychologist.
or do I want to be a computer scientist?
Yeah.
By that time, it was that starkly clear. I had been a member of the Institute for Human Learning at Berkeley. Leo Postman was the director, a famous experimental psychologist. Art Jensen was a member of that group, but he was the guy who provoked a lot of controversy with his book on IQ, if you remember back in the 60s. Anyway, so I could have chosen to go down that route, and for example, of the several routes that Herb Simon chose in his life, one was economics and he won a Nobel Prize for it, but one was psychology and he won that same equivalent prize in psychology, and so did Newell. I could have been one of those, but for two reasons I decided, and I got an offer from the University of Oregon Psychology Department, very good one, actually, and I think there were maybe three reasons why I chose computer science. One was that it allowed me to remain in the San Francisco Bay Area. The second one was I'll give them sort of in reverse order. Second one was that by 1964, I had become fed up with psychologists. I had become fed up with their methodology, with their way of doing business, with their now that doesn't mean Gordon Bauer at Stanford or Dick Atkinson or Pat Suppies, but it means the general run of psychologists just didn't have I saw their experiments as being a whole lot of knob twiddling. They'd come up with some paradigm and they'd set up an experimental paradigm and they'd farm out to 30 graduate students, this setting of the knob, 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 go do that experiment. And
Okay.
it was just a
It had gotten away from its roots, become Baroque and institutionalized.
Right, right. But the most important reason was that I really looked inside myself, and I knew that I was a kind of a techno geek. And I loved computers, and I loved gadgets, and I loved programming. And so the dominant thread was not going to be what humans do, it was going to be what can I make computers do.
Right, and what you love to do, yeah. So could you have stayed at Berkeley and been a computer scientist?
Yeah, I had, I don't know if I mentioned it in this interview, but Berkeley was the environment was terrible for computer science in '64 because there was a raging battle going on under the scenes between the Humanities and Sciences College, Letters and Sciences, I'm sorry, they call it Letters and Sciences, and engineering, but as to who was going to own this new discipline. And it was not pleasant. But later on, it got all cleared up, and it became a very nice place. And if I had gotten tenure at Berkeley, if I had tenure at Berkeley, if I had just stayed there, I wouldn't have stayed in the business school. I would have moved over into this EECS department, or probably would have moved over to one of the two departments that actually got formed.
Right.
And it would have been a great life. I had a wonderful house there. It eventually burned in that Oakland fire. Remember that huge fire?
Oh, the Oakland fire. Oh, okay. The free speech movement was going on about that, or starting.
Yeah, that was ugly.
About that time.
The free speech movement was ugly. It actually was bubbling during the time that, well, there was a period when I had already decided to go to Stanford, and I knew when I was going to leave Berkeley, which was December 31st, 1964. Mm-hmm. And the free speech thing bubbled up right in the middle while I was on a trip to 1964 trip to the Soviet Union. I read about the riots in Berkeley in an English language newspaper in Leningrad, which was mostly a propaganda sheet, except it talked about, it showed a picture of this guy on a car. What was his name, the famous guy? He and Joan Baez were the two big names in the Berkeley rebellion, but he's the guy who got in the car. And anyway, it was going on when I got back to Berkeley after the trip, and then there were meetings of the academic senate, and it was pretty uncomfortable.
Well, I mean, you said something about being in Wheeler Hall or something. That's where a lot of the confrontations were, right around there too, I think.
My office was on the second floor of Wheeler.
Yeah.
Wheeler Auditorium was on the ground
Auditorium.
floor, and my office was on the second floor.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I'm so glad you chose Stanford.
Thanks to McCarthy, incidentally.
Yeah.
That's a historical note.
Is that, you mean John was much more the tempting force than George
Well, no,
Forsyth?
Forsyth would not have known about me if John hadn't pointed me out.
Yeah, okay. So, was it difficult to move, though?
No.
So,
It was not. In fact, it was, you mean, we had a lovely house in Berkeley, so, with a grand view of the bay. So that was tough to leave, but we did it. I mean, people do that.
I mean, you had a toddler, you had a 1-year-old daughter, or something like that?
Yeah.
But, okay, but anyway, you're struggling with other things in life too, as well as making these big branching decisions, but this turned out to be a decision that, that was permanent, that you stayed at Stanford and didn't keep moving around after that. So I mean, this is one of the big forking times in your life in some sense.
Absolutely, and maybe that's just the way I am. Penny and I bought our house in 1975 on the Stanford campus, roughly the same time that you built your house. You built your house a few years earlier, I think, but you haven't moved and I haven't moved. Mm-hmm. We still live in the same places. Yeah. But what was I going to say about the move? There was a thing which I will call the Great Attractor, like the astrophysicists talk about. In 1964, Carl Pribram of the psychology department, a neuropsychologist at Stanford, who had been a co-author of a well-known psychology book that built on the work of Newell and Simon, Miller, Galanter, and Pribram, Plans and the Structure of Behavior. Carl was running a seminar series, a Saturday seminar series at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, which is a think tank for the behavioral sciences on the hill behind Stanford. For those of you who are in the future there, you might not even know it. Carl's seminar was on essentially what you might call AI or cognition or models of mind or just generally that area. And one of the people interested in models of mind that a computer could do was Joshua Lederberg, who eventually became a very close a colleague I worked very closely with, Nobel Prize winner in genetics. And he was interested in an aspect of it which was exactly what I had come to by thinking hard about where I wanted to go next in my research, which is to model the thinking processes of scientists, because I was interested in problems of induction, not problems of puzzle solving or theorem proving or anything like that, but inductive hypothesis formation. And that's just why Josh got involved with the group of people who were meeting there. He had just come into the field, reintroduced himself to computing via a course he took with George Forsyth on algol, and was interested in that subject. Knew McCarthy, had talked to McCarthy about should AI be on a planet probe that he and other people, Carl Sagan I think, were planning to land on Mars. So
let me try to get this straight. You met these people after you came to Stanford?
No, I met Josh it must have been the spring or summer of '64, before I left to go on this big trip to.
So already you're coming to Stanford. I mean, you knew Gordon Bauer and Pat Suppies and
Dick Atkinson.
Dick Atkinson. Okay,
Yeah.
Our stellar psychologist, and also Josh Lederberg. Even though you're across the bay, you're coming over here quite often. That's interesting.
So then when I did come here, the first person I got a hold of was Josh, and we started our project, and Gordon Bauer and I co-advised John Anderson, now a famous psychologist, doing work in the information processing psychology area.
Okay, great. So now your job at Stanford was quite different also in other ways from at Berkeley, because you were the director of the computation center as well. So this is another aspect. I mean, not just research into studying scientific things, but also a major administrative role as well. And presumably you'd be teaching classes also that were different from what you were teaching at Berkeley. So a lot of preparation for classes. Besides, is that approximately right?
Yeah.
So it's a big also change in exactly what you're doing every day.
Yeah.
Right?
Let me give you the timing of it, a little fine grain on the timing. I got to Stanford officially January 1st, 1965. So did Bill Miller officially on the same
birth
day.
of our department.
And we were born actually on the Friday after that.
Oh, okay.
At an academic council meeting.
Okay.
So I was an associate professor of mathematics for a few days. Imagine that. I want you historians to note that. But anyway, it wasn't, so George Forsyth was running both the new department and the Stanford Computation Center, which at that time was going to shift machines from a Burroughs B5500 to something else. I think that was at that time. The something else was going to be either a major IBM machine or a set of machines based on a big gift, or it was going to be an upgraded to another Burroughs machine, a faster Burroughs machine, or it might be a CDC 6400 or CDC 6600. So it was going to be a big deal deciding.
We had a PDP something or other too, didn't we? At that?
There was a PDP-1 that John McCarthy was running for time-sharing experiments shared with Pat Suppies.
Okay.
But it was not available to anyone else except John's group. John was building the time-sharing system, and Pat was using it for computer-based learning. So George, by mid-year, he just felt he had to give up something. He couldn't do them all. So he talked it around to all of us and said, I've got to give this up. Does anyone want to do this? Bill Miller didn't want to do it. Bill was running the computer group at Slack, and
I think George was also president of ACM at about that time.
maybe that's
Yeah.
also the reason.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, I'll do it. And I did it more or less for the same reason that I do a lot of strange things in my life, and maybe for the same reason that maybe I just liked my experience with Dave Evans getting sort of immersed in what you might call real computing when at Berkeley. In this case, it would be getting involved with real computing in the sense of buying machines, talking to vendors, discussing time-sharing systems in detail, making something happen, blah, 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 all of that stuff. I really got sick of it after a few years, and it.
So the salesmen are taking you out to lunch every day?
Maybe every week.
I don't know, yeah.
But it was very interesting for a while. And Bill Miller helped me out a tremendous amount in making those decisions. That was the time when we did some experiments on Slack computing to find out what kind of computer was best for their codes. That was
Okay, so Slack is way up.
yeah. We were
miles
trying to
away.
unify. We were trying to unify our purchase. So we were going to.
Oh, Slack hadn't bought the.
No, they hadn't bought their machine yet. We were trying to decide whether to get a CDC machine or an IBM 360/90 or 91.
In 1965, I
Yeah.
don't think the Model 91, well, maybe it was. I didn't see a 91 until 68 or something like that.
Well, maybe they didn't deliver it till then,
Yeah,
but
they-
and the other one was Josh Lederberg was promoting a computer for the medical school.
Okay.
And that was we ended up with a 36050 there with a so-called mass memory, which was, I think,
Yeah.
1 megabyte core.
Yeah, I was gonna,
And I hired Gio Wiederhold, because I knew him from Berkeley,
I see.
to run that machine.
Okay,
To run
so-
that machine.
So you were working with Bill Miller, because he was responsible for the computer that the physicists were going to be doing. And on the other hand, the one that you were going to be responsible for was the undergraduates at Stanford, and maybe the administration also?
Yeah, no, well, very good point. So Stanford was trying to put together, Stanford does everything, or at least at that time, did everything on a shoestring. People don't realize how little real Stanford money was in all of this. In fact, all of us guys in computer science, and when I say guys, I mean the women faculty members as well, we all had to raise half of our money. I mean, it was only half Stanford money and half soft money. And that went on for quite a long time. Well, the same was true of computing. So we had to put together as many bucks as we can find. And one way to do that was to graft administrative computing onto campus computing. Campus computing was paid time from research projects mostly. A little bit of Stanford money put in there to handle undergraduate and graduate teaching, because the government wouldn't let them get away with faking that underneath the surface. You had to pay for that, just like the government projects had to pay for it. And administrative computing. And then Bill ran his own facility, and the medical school paid for its own facility with grants.
And SRI?
Oh, SRI also came in. That's right. We made a little deal with them to use up some of our computing time. That's right. I forgot about that. But turns out the administrative computing was a gigantic headache. And it's not all their fault.
Software was...
In the sense that they had for them, it was really important that the paychecks got printed on a certain day at a certain time. For us research computing guys, it didn't matter if your thing was delayed, or you'd feel bad about it, but still nothing bad would happen in your life. If the administrative computing thing didn't happen, they were in deep trouble with the government, they were in deep trouble with their employees, so,
I have to say the same thing. I was a consultant to Burroughs where, where we're making the machines in Southern California. But when Burroughs puts out its own paychecks, they would run a computer that was simulating an old computer that was simulating another one that worked in 1958, because that was the only thing that would reliably make paychecks.
so eventually administrative computing and us got a divorce.
Okay.
And then later on, they glued them together again, and then they had to get another divorce, round about 1990 or something like that. There was another.
Okay, but you had to make sure that this thing was up 24/7 or more or less, something like that. Now, did you have a choice of making it like the model that you preferred at Carnegie, where you could push the buttons yourself, or did you choose a model like you had to use when you were at NPL, where you're submitting
Oh,
jobs to an
actually, it
operator?
wasn't, when I was talking about the British experience, it wasn't me at NPL that was having that problem. It was the researchers at Cambridge, because Maurice Wilkes was insisting on that mode of operation where you shoved the cards through the window and got your paper. But by now, computing was such big business, I have a feeling this machine we bought, the 360-65, also a big story there, why it was a 65 and not a 67, was, I believe it was a $2.5 million machine with an operating budget of maybe $2 million a year. And at that point, we just couldn't put that in the hands of individuals. Now, we did later, but I shouldn't say we. I should cross my name off of that and write in John McCarthy. John, bless him, just kept insisting on time sharing for the campus. And he eventually got that through the university to put in money for the low overhead time sharing system. And then dozens of people, hundreds of people around the campus could have their fingers on the computer.
Right.
And
So it was a matter of, by that time, being a huge expense in the budget, which was different from when we were undergrads. Yeah, very good. Okay, so now, when I mentioned my plan is to sort of fill in the chronological part of this interview, although we're still in 1965.
Go ahead.
And, so we got 40 years to go.
I will speed up.
But I want to just give a reference so that when we get together again in 2 weeks, we can talk about the cross-cutting things that go through the rest of your life. So the way I would say the next major episode is that about this time, you said you met Lederberg and problems of mutual interest, but then by the time I met you in 1968, you had started up a major research lab, so I'd like you to talk a little bit about the birth pangs of the heuristic programming project.
Don was just saying heuristic programming project. Maybe I should say that slower. Heuristic programming project. And what was it? It started out being called the Dendro Project. Dendro was the project that Joshua Lederberg and I started in 1965 on hypothesis formation in in the area of organic chemistry based on mass spectrometric and other physical data. We had recruited Carl Gerasi in 67 or 66 to collaborate with us, a famous chemist, and had good results, very good results. So by 1970, more or less, we, A, had a lot of credibility. B, we had a lot of confidence, like we really knew what we were doing. We had invented a knowledge representation for the chemical knowledge that we thought was broadly applicable. It was somewhat based on Bob Floyd's work and Floyd Evans' productions and Newell's adaptation of that into rule-based systems. So we thought we knew what we were doing. And we thought we needed to play in some other playpens, not better playpens, but other playpens. And since Josh was a professor in the medical school, and medicine seemed to be like a good place to look because it was kind of an inexact science. It wasn't unscientific, but it was inexact. And if you're like me, you kind of believe that AI is a kind of a qualitative science, not a quantitative science. So you're looking for places where heuristics can come into play and inexact knowledge and so on. So we began to look for medical applications and found some. Led to a long string of medical-oriented things we did. But at that point, we didn't want to be known as, Dendro was a project in chemistry. We wanted to be broader, so we needed an umbrella term. And the term I invented was Heuristic Programming Project, meaning we could cover several of these things. Now, why that? Two reasons. McCarthy was using the word artificial intelligence in Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab, and there was no way I was going to infringe on John's sort of, he was there first, and he's going to use that word. Secondly, boy, artificial intelligence was really a controversial term. It was like touching a nerve in people's body. People were writing books, anti-artificial intelligence books, Joe Weizenbaum's book, and there were several others, and DARPA directors would think that it's crazy to work on artificial intelligence.
It's scaring people down.
Yeah, so I just said, look, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to call it programming, something. So there's dynamic programming, there's linear programming. What's wrong with heuristic programming? That's what I do. That's what I call the project. And there really were no birth pangs. It was just smooth, what you might say, growing a family. The only problem is selling this idea to, like, how do you sell work on organic chemistry to DARPA? Or how do you sell some other things to NIH that weren't medical? It was a balancing act, and Lederberg and I just had to use kind of joint credibility to do this.
Were you co-principal investigators?
Yeah, on most everything, yeah. Or we would trade off, like things for the medical school, like the Acme computer, the 36050. He was the sole principal investigator of that, and I was the director of computing. But we'd alternate. On the DARPA project, I was the PI of that because Licklider knew me. And for the NIH project, we were co-PIs, and then gave the whole thing over to Carl Gerasi to be PI.
And later you had larger and larger staff and your own computers and things like that, but this was, I'm not sure how long it took to.
Oh, well, so then it was in the early 70s that we decided to essentially do what John had done for the Artificial Intelligence Lab. We needed a machine for our work.
Right.
And so we got Josh and I put in proposals, actually a lot of hard work, to get NIH money. And then we got Licklider to agree that since we were also an ARPA project, we were the only non-defense contract thing on the ARPANET for a while. We were a medical thing. NIH was supporting it, but Licklider said, yeah, you're one of us, so you can be on the ARPANET. Tom Rindfleisch came from Caltech to build and run that facility for Josh and me. It's called SumX.
Right, so you had research associates who were not, who were hired by the project.
Yes, lots of research associates, very similar to John's situation. That eventually, that was a big thing at Stanford. You had big laboratories that were operating that way with research associates. Some people of them were research professors. That later fell out of style at Stanford. That later became known as the SRI style of doing business. So why are you doing SRI stuff at Stanford? If you're going to do business that way, do it outside of Stanford.
Well,
It fell into the pattern of faculty-student stuff, and that happened more or less when we moved into the School of Engineering.
So are students involved in the early days of HPP too, or is it mostly the professors doing the research? I mean, do you have?
HPP?
Like Raj Reddy, for example, was he?
He was a graduate student of John McCarthy's when I got here in '65. He was working, using the PDP-1 to do his speech research. I put out a memo, the first Dendro memo was joint with a young guy who left us. He was an assistant professor here at Stanford. He left pretty quickly thereafter, named Dick Watson, a systems guy, but he thought he might want to do AI. And we wrote a joint paper called Opportunities for Graduate Research. That was the name of it. Came out in the spring of '65, and as a result, we attracted two students, two master students, Georgia Sutherland and Bill White, and they turned out to be major contributors to the Dendro Project for years. And then we had an extremely hard time, I mean really hard, getting any computer science student interested in the real Dendro, doing a thesis in the Dendro line. And the reason was it involved chemistry. Now, to go back a couple hours in this interview, I was mentioning that when Newell and Simon did GPS, the amount of knowledge they put in was this big. Nothing, right. Almost nothing. Right. And here we were putting in just a lot of chemical knowledge, and we had to extract it from the heads of Carl Djerassi and his people in chemistry, and it was we were inventing knowledge engineering as we were going along. And computer science students felt that they don't do that their field is algorithms. And knowledge, epistemology, is somebody else's business. Like it's a chemist's business or it's a doctor's business, but it's not their business.
Let me try to rephrase it, that you couldn't do Dendro with only a small part of chemistry, only knowing a little bit of, like carbon atoms or something. You had to know a lot of chemistry. It's not like you could do these trigonometry formulas without knowing a lot of math. I think. So, but you got people in like Harold Brown.
So Harold was hired.
He's a group theorist, but he can study some of the combinatorial things that go on when you're trying to decide whether two chemical molecules are similar or something like this, right?
Well, so Harold Brown was a mathematician at Ohio State, and the ability to attract a tenured mathematician from Ohio State to work on our project was simply sensational. He was just a wonderful addition to our project, a great applied mathematician. We ran into many difficult problems when we tried to, when we moved forward from acyclic graphs to cyclic molecules, especially the rather complicated cyclic molecules that the Djerassi group was working on. And then we had to do a generator for that, and we had to prove that the generator was generating exhaustively and irredundantly, and Harold was able to both lead us into how to make the generator and then going through the proof sequences to prove that it really was doing that.
Yeah, so it has to be quantitative as well as qualitative in that sense.
Well, our generator had to be.
Yeah.
But in chess, for example, the generator doesn't have to be.
No, but the research has, if you just say you're running only on qualitative, I don't know, it seems to me, it seems to be a shaky, it doesn't have a foundation. There's also some quantitative things which you reach down to, but although it's not your life, it's necessary to have these numbers at the bottom in order to build up the structure. So
yeah, Don, I don't want to, I agree with you, but I don't want to agree with you too much.
Yeah.
Because that's a case that is always overmade in computer science, that in AI there's, somehow at the bottom there's this real hard-nosed quantitative stuff. And that's only, that attitude is only a very recent one.
You misunderstand. I'm saying that you also need somebody like Harold Brown in order to show quantitatively how this qualitative stuff fits together.
Okay.
Now,
anyway, but the general point is right, that we had to hire in a lot of our talent. And that gave the impression, which was okay for a long time, that we're building a research lab with professional staff.
All right, now I'm going to try to stick to my goal of moving through the high level instead of indulging all of my instincts to go to the low level details and move forward. The heuristic programming project thrived and then changed its name to the Knowledge Systems Laboratory, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
let me explain.
Yeah.
Very simple. Just as we needed a bigger umbrella term from Dendro to HPP, we needed a bigger one because later on in the early 80s, because Ted Shortliff had come back from his residency, was hired as an assistant professor. He wanted to have his own HPP, which he called it the section on medical informatics of the Department of Medicine Research Laboratory. And SUMEX had become a pretty big entity on its own by that time. So we needed a bigger umbrella term. So HPP became one of the units of a bigger thing called the Knowledge Systems Laboratory, which was then my lab with Bruce Buchanan, Ted Shortliff's lab, and SUMEX. And then we got Tom Rinfleisch to run the joint laboratories.
Maybe we ought to clarify this for our audience, that SUMEX was well, I knew it as a computer in the medical school that was a successor to another computer called ACME. And Bruce Buchanan was kind of a right-hand man for you in the heuristic programming.
Well, I hired Bruce. Bruce is a very important person in the whole history of this project. I first hired Bruce as a summer employee at Rand while he was doing his thesis in the philosophy of science. A wonderful thesis called Logics of Scientific Discovery, and then convinced him not to take a job as an assistant professor of philosophy somewhere, but to come work for Josh and myself. And then he eventually became a research professor at Stanford and then a university professor at the University of Pittsburgh.
Okay, right. So that, as you say, then these came together and become the Knowledge Systems Laboratory. Approximately when was that?
I'm guessing approximately 1981, plus or minus 1 year.
After you'd moved into Jack's.
I think,
After you moved into Jack's Hall.
I have a feeling it may have, yes, after we moved into Jackson, we may have already moved over to our Welsh Road location. I'm not sure exactly
Yeah,
about
okay,
the time.
So approximately then it's, and that's because you realize that that knowledge was somehow the key more than just heuristics for manipulating knowledge. But I mean, it's where we're, if I remember correctly, the talk is going away from databases to knowledge bases. And the way I understood it was that databases is a bunch of facts, knowledge bases is a bunch of metafact, or
Yeah.
facts about facts.
Generalizations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, I mean, you're quite right. And the date of we'll get to that next time. We'll get to the aha moments. But
Right.
the date of that thing is 1968, when I was writing a paper for one of Donald Mickey's symposia in Britain. And I felt it was necessary by 68 to kind of summarize everything we had done from 65. What's the meaning of all those experiments that we did from 65 through 68? What can you... Anyway, that turned out to be a thing called the knowledge is power hypothesis.
Okay.
And then we kind of tested that out with dozens of projects after that,
Right.
and came to the conclusion that that you don't need much more than an Aristotle in the machine. You don't need a whole big logical machinery. You need modus ponens and backward and forward chaining and not much else, and not much is going on in the way of inference. Knowing a lot is what counts. And so that leads to things like calling the laboratory Knowledge Systems Lab, but even more important, it names things like, for example, I tried, and in my archives, there's a document that's in this old IBM paper that we were all using at the time on a printer, of a report that I wrote for Steve Lukasik, the director of DARPA, when he was in one of his skeptical modes about AI, and Alan Newell asked me if I would sort of, it's your turn, Ed, right up the field for Lucasic. And I rewrote the field in terms of knowledge. And for example, machine learning wasn't machine learning, it turned into knowledge acquisition. Because I knew that's what the important thing was. It wasn't the little parameters that an evaluation function was learning, it was acquiring these metafacts, as you call them.
Okay. And maybe we should say something about your archives. You have done a great service by recording all these early days in the hard copy and all the things that you have from the things that Lederberg did at that time and so on. And can you say where that archive reposes
Yeah, sure.
now?
Let me tell you where mine is, and then I'll say something about Josh Lederberg's archives, which are way better than mine. But I got the whole idea of saving things for history from Josh. He was really careful about that, and so was Herb Simon. So I was pretty careful about it, and I would not only save things, but I would put metadata on the things so that someone later on could, including myself, could figure out what they were all about. It ended up with a first accession in 1985, roughly, to the Stanford Library Special Collection, Edward Feigenbaum collection, about 40 boxes. These are the acid-free boxes that they use, for which there were audio tape annotations and finder's guides. Then a second accession was done in 2000, I think it was begun in 2005, and it's still ongoing right now, of another, roughly speaking, 85 or 90 boxes of things of my career since then, for which these materials are still being prepared. It's a slow process. It's expensive, too. And it's going to end up in digitized form. The library is digitizing a lot of the material right now, and there's going to be a website similar to the Herbert Simon and Alan Newell websites. However, there's one very special website that people ought to, well, you people 50 years from now, maybe it will be gone, but the National Library of Medicine created a series of special autobiographical websites and archival websites, of which the first one was Joshua Lederberg's website. So if you go to Google right now and type in Joshua Lederberg, the first hit will be this nlm.gov Profiles of Science. And there is a absolutely beautiful one. Josh did one for himself. He did one for Oswald Avery, the discoverer that DNA is the genetic material. And then NLM has done several more, like a dozen more, for Nobel Prize winners in biology and medicine.
And I met somebody a week or two ago that said he was working with you on putting this into the semantic web.
Yeah, so there is a project to, I'm leading, co-directing a project along with Mike Keller, the director of the Stanford Libraries, to make software, to make a software system available that will allow not just special people like Lederberg or so, but anybody to organize a professional archive and make it available in an accessible form, maybe widely distributed by, if you're in computer science, maybe by the Computer History Museum or the ACM. If it's some other field, there's a model of it, which is your software on digital typography, which is now used by many fields, not just mathematics, for typesetting. And the idea would be to do many fields here, except here it's a little, there's a wiggle on it, which is that it's one thing to build a conceptual structure that fits other computer scientists' lives. They don't even fit exactly. It fits more or less exactly with John McCarthy's life, my life, and John McCarthy's more or less, not quite so much with yours, but the gap to a biologist or a lawyer or a historian would be a lot more. So there's going to be some ontology work needed to be done for these other fields.
That sounds like a great service to all sciences. Right, well, moving right along, you were chair of our department from 1976 to 1981, if I'm not mistaken. And that was a pivotal time in the history of Stanford Computer Science because we moved into a new building in the center of campus from many sites all around the campus. Maybe you can say just a few words about how you view that particular part as far as serving the department is concerned, as opposed to working on in your lab.
It's a tough thing to talk about. I rarely do things I don't like to do. So I've got to say, historically speaking, it must have been the case that I really wanted to do that. And it must be because of either the legacy of Forsyth or maybe it was my feeling that the department needed something in addition to what Bob Floyd had done, or maybe, I don't know what. But it was, in my professional life, it was an enormously productive time. My second wife, Penny, and I had gotten married in '75, and that was like kickstarting a new life. And it was wonderful. And it kickstarted everything else. And things were really booming along. That's when I started the Handbook of Artificial Intelligence project that resulted in 4 volumes later on and published in '81 through '84. And the Dendro, the second half of that, the Dendro work was coasting along under Carl Jurassi's PI-ship, but not only had we done a lot of work on Mycin, which was quite well known, but by that time we had so much confidence that we were trying everything. I did a sonar signal processing application. It was a very, very difficult one. It was done for DARPA in a classified way, but I had to get I had to figure out how to get those new systems described in a way that wouldn't violate classification. They were excellent systems. We did X-ray crystallography. We did other engineering applications. We were distributing software like crazy. Then we started some companies to take that on. So it was an extremely productive time.
In spite of the fact that you're also chair of the department.
Yeah, and I just cannot imagine, A, why I did it, and B, how I did it. I know that I survived because I hired Denny Brown, so wonderful young student, actually. He didn't finish his PhD, but he was just fabulous in knowing our department and helping me through. And we just decided that the one thing the faculty didn't want was committee work. So Denny and I would do the whole thing. We would just, except for admitting new students, we would just do all the committee work and wouldn't call. You remember that? I think you came in to thank me once for that.
I'm sure I did.
And I just don't see how we did it. And it was a very stressful time because the one thing Bob Floyd and the rest of us had agreed to do was to move into a space which was too small. And we were doing it on the basis of a theory which we had learned from Don Knuth, which was called the sardine can theory. Yes. That you're most productive when you're most stressed in a sardine can. And maybe that was it, but it was really stressful in that sardine can.
Especially because the field refused to stop growing.
And we had gotten so well known in our area that money kept pouring in. Licklider was long since gone. He had told me at one point to double my budget. He said, "Why are you asking for so little money?" And then later on, Bob Kahn basically did the same thing. So we were growing like crazy. We had to move out of Margaret Jacks Hall into another place, rented space on a location near Stanford. But it was very stressful. And so during the period, I actually took 2 one-quarter sabbaticals. And the reason being, I was just too stressed out. I couldn't stand it. I had to go. One time I went off to, and the other time to Paris for a quarter as a consultant for Schlumberger doing an expert system there. But and finally, I just gave it up. I really had 2 3-year terms. I had a 3-year term, and it was renewed for 3 years. But in 81, I just said, I can't do this anymore.
So, was that your first sabbatical, though?
I don't remember.
Sabbatical usually is every 7 years, but you started in 1960.
No, I was, yeah, I may have taken, almost all my sabbaticals I took as leave at Stanford, living here,
Oh, I
without
see.
moving.
I see. But then later, okay, so I guess we're understanding the timeline pretty much. We're getting to the 1980s when all of a sudden a lot of companies are being started to make available these successful kinds of software known as expert systems. And we'll talk next time about expert systems in detail.
Okay?
As of course, because this was another big world-changing thing. Now, but you're zooming between then and now. I'm thinking that also there were other times when you took leaves of absence, especially for national service. And so can you sort of just give a timeline from 1980 till now?
Yeah.
As how your life divided?
Yeah, sort of. I would put them in these categories. I would say that it's hard to find words for it, but the numbers are, roughly speaking, 83 to 90, or 84 to 90, was a period in which I made a decision to change course in the kind of research we were doing at the Knowledge Systems Lab. I mean, personally, not myself. Excuse me, not the lab. Personally, I decided to change course into parallel computing. In particular, multiprocessor parallelism, not massive parallelism a la the thinking machines machine, but more like what Gordon Bell was doing with 5 processors, 20 processors, something like that. And I wanted to see to what extent AI techniques, software techniques, could be adapted to that kind of a parallel world, especially the techniques called blackboard techniques, which were so powerful. It's the most powerful thing we've ever developed and worked on. It turned out, I mean, there's a whole story behind that, how successful we were, moderately, and why we weren't more successful, and why are we so successful now? It turns out the world has changed from a massively parallel view of parallelism to 4 cores on a chip, and that's the kind of thing we were working on. So that, in a way, what we did then is more relevant to today than it was to the 90s. And then came a stretch of time when I was dissociating myself from the day-to-day running of the laboratory, because I had made a decision around 89 that it was pretty much the same decision Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy had made a lot earlier, which is they were not going to be responsible for the fundraising for the laboratory anymore. It's too much work. So
it sounds like what I told you I was doing in 1989.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Les Ernest for a long time was doing that for John. Raj Reddy was doing it for Al Newell, and so on. And Bruce Buchanan and Bob Engelmore and Rich Fikes later on began to do it at the KSL. And that was from like 90 through 93, early 94. But in 94, an amazing thing happened. I mean, a lightning bolt. The phone rings, and it's a person that I knew, but I had only met once, from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, one of the members, Sheila Widnall, a faculty member at MIT. And she calls up and says that, did I know anyone who wanted to be chief scientist of the Air Force? And by the way, if you're interested, let me know. And then she didn't tell me why, but it turned out that she had been already picked by the Clinton administration for being Secretary of the Air Force. And she was looking for her chief scientist. And I talked to my wife about it overnight and called her back the next day and said, yeah, I'm going to do that. And she wanted a commitment of 3 years. That's more than normal. Normally, they would like a commitment of 2 years, but she wanted 3, and I said, that's okay with me. Yes, I'll plan on that, and we'll take a look at it at the end of 2. And I actually stayed 3 years doing it. Then I came back to Stanford, and it was a rather unsettling experience to come back to Stanford. Partly, you come back to Stanford after
3 years.
playing out on a big stage. And then all of a sudden, you come back and they look around and say, what are you going to teach next year? As opposed to, let's say, Sheila, when she stopped being Secretary of the Air Force, she was given a university professorship at MIT to basically do whatever she wants.
Yeah.
And so I had to go back to teaching the normal kind of AI stuff. And that's a lot of work, actually, in a field that's rapidly changing as ours. And the other thing is, Rich Fikes was doing a great job running the lab, and he had his own people, and I wasn't about to start up anything new at that point. So after a relatively short time, by the end of, roughly speaking, the beginning of 2000, end of 99, or somewhere in there, I retired. And then, since then, I've been leading a wonderful life doing what I damn please. And doing this project with the library and doing a lot of consulting for the Air Force.
Now, the Air Force was also the sponsor of RAND. Did you have connection with Air Force, all the way through, or was this sort of a new thing in 1994?
The answer is yes and no and yes. I had been involved with Air Force-like problems by being involved with RAND as a consultant over the years. On the other hand, periodically and routinely, the Air Force had asked me if I would be on the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, SAB, and routinely I would turn that down, that being a job which is very time-consuming, and that is time-consuming in the sense of about 20 to 25 days a year. And there was no particular time in my life when I had 20 to 25 days a year to devote to that purpose. So I kept turning that down. Bob Cannon from the Aero-Astro Department was a friend of mine, has been a friend of mine for a long time. He was the one who first told me what a wonderful time he had in 1965 coming out of a deanship at Caltech. He went to become chief scientist of the Air Force. And I said, what's that? And this was a long time ago. He just told me about that. And so when Sheila called, I was all set to think positively about that job. And Bob was right, Sheila was right. I talked to Bill Perry. He was defense secretary. He may have been deputy defense secretary at that moment of time, but he became defense secretary. And I talked to Bill Perry, and he said, Ed, what better time? Anita Jones is DD-R&E. I'm DOD head. This is a great time to do it. So it was.
So as you're there, are you spending most of your time at the Pentagon, or are they flying you around all over the world, talking to troops, or
Yeah.
who are you talking to as chief scientist?
The office of the chief scientist is in the Pentagon. It's on it's in the Air Force portion of the Pentagon, in a big shot designation place. That is, it's on the outer ring where you get windows that look out on the real world. But the job actually, when I first went in to talk to my boss, the way the hierarchy works, my boss was the chief of staff of the Air Force. It wasn't Sheila, actually, even though she hired me. It was the chief of staff of the Air Force. When I went to talk to him, one of the first things he said to me was, I want you out of this building. You don't learn anything in this building. So I took him seriously and just went everywhere. That took me to a large number of Air Force bases, and it took me to other countries like consulting, not consulting, but doing liaison with the, let's say, the Israeli Air Force and their scientific staffs, or helping the DOD build relationships with some members who were going to join NATO, like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. So I went to all of those. I gave a talk for the Air Force kind of a keynote speech in a conference they were running in St. Petersburg, and many, many other things like that. And so I was away. In fact, one of the reasons I didn't want to get a really expensive apartment in Washington was I knew I wasn't going to be spending much time in it, because I'd be going to places like Cheyenne Mountain and
What's Cheyenne?
that's where the Air Defense Command is, but that's also the place where they had a gigantic software snafu. And so the question is, why did they have that software snafu, and
I see.
what happened there?
So you also do some debugging?
Well, it was
for
more
that.
like organizational and contractual debugging.
But as you go to these other places, it's so that you can bring back knowledge from there to the Pentagon too?
Yeah. So I was a member of the Air Staff, which means that I was invited to all the meetings, actually daily, or more like maybe 3 times a week, of the Chief of Staff and the 4 stars and 3 stars that were running the different big blocks of the Air Force. And I'd sit in on the meetings to the extent that I was in the Pentagon those days. And then I'd be writing memos to the chief, or going in to talk to Sheila about something, or going downstairs to talk to Anita Jones about something that was a DOD-wide problem.
What level of security clearances?
Top secret. I didn't have any special clearances that I remember, except once when I had to get something really special to go into see the Atomic Bomb History Museum at Los Alamos. That was awesome. That was just awesome.
But you needed special clearance to see that, you said?
Actually, to tell you the truth, I really never got that special clearance. They applied for it, it didn't come in time, and they just sort of broke the rules to take me through that door.
Well, we'll never tell anybody.
No, you'll never tell anyone in history.
Okay.
But anyway, it was a fantastic time. Not only that, but also asking the Air Force to fly me in an F-15 and an F-16, and I actually flew a B-52 bomber I was on a war game, and after the virtual bombing was done, I flew the B-52 back to its air base and did virtual bombing myself. And
I'm just trying to check this out. You were 60 years old or something like that. I mean, okay, well, this scares me, but.
But anyway, great time.
Okay.
At taxpayer expense.
So you think, so anyway, you can look back on that time as something that you were able to give back to to your country, or something like, how do you?
First of all, I felt that way. And second of all, it was a buoyant time to be there. And I think the Clinton administration was a buoyant time until the Monica Lewinsky thing and the impeachment thing came up. But it was a pretty buoyant time in Washington. Everyone was feeling good about everything. The war was over, Cold War was over, things were changing. Bill Perry, wonderful, wonderful person, and marvelous defense secretary, was running the show. MIT professor was head of the Air Force. I mean, what more can you, it couldn't be better.
Could you also make strategic?
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to.
Improvements in the
Pentagon
is using computers?
That was the key thing that felt really good. I was the first person to be asked to be chief scientist who wasn't an aero-astro person or a weapons person or a laser person, but there hadn't been any computer scientists before. And what Sheila had in mind was she wanted a software expert in there, because the Air Force, she looked at the Air Force as having a giant software problem. And when I took a look at it, it was giant software problem squared. And what I was able to do there, I really did 2 big things, I think. 3 big things. One was consciousness raising about software. In fact, the one big report I wrote at the end of my term, the one that got circulated and got briefed to all these generals, was a report called "It's a Software First World." The Air Force had not realized that. They don't think that. They think it's a titanium frame-based world. They don't understand that those things just fly because of the computers in them. That's one thing. And I said 3, and I'm going to probably only remember 2, but that was one of them. The other one was software development. They really have believed in fact, the contracting world that they structure for themselves and deal with can only imagine a structured programming top-down world. They can't imagine, because they know how to do that. You set up requirements and you get another contractor to break up the requirements into blocks, and another contractor breaks them up into many blocks, and down at the bottom there are some people writing the code. And it takes 8 years to do that code. When it all comes back up to the top, A, it doesn't interact with, it doesn't fit, and B, it's not what you want anymore. And they just don't know how to do the contracting for cyclical development. And no matter, I mean, if Barry Baim could be talking, Barry Baim is a software engineering expert at USC, he could be talking to them forever about cyclical development methods, and they won't know how to implement it in their contracting structure. Well, I think we were able to work that through and got the main Air Force procurement place that's in Massachusetts near Boston to get that all figured out, how to do that. So that was really good. What else about software? I never did really figure out how to get AI ideas through to, I mean, they were, not that the Air Force didn't have them, or the Army didn't have them. The Army actually had an AI center in the Pentagon, but it never became a big deal.
This was before there was a lot of things about sensor networks and so on, which are...
No, that was another big deal.
Yeah.
Sensor networks and integrating the what's coming in through the sensor networks with what I would call, as an AI person, centralized model building. They would call it decision aids for command and control. And that was
Centralized instead of distributed.
it wasn't distributed, yeah. At that time, anyway. I don't know
Right.
how it is now.
Right.
But
No.
another thing that we did that I thought was very, very useful, it was Sheila's idea, and I only contributed 1/10 to it. Sheila decided that it was, I think she said 50 years since von Karman had written the original blueprint for Hap Arnold as to how science can aid the Air Force. Science and technology can aid the Air Force. Von Karman he wasn't called chief scientist, but he was like the original one. He was called something else. So he was chief scientist number 0. And 50 years later, Sheila said, it's time for a new plan. Von Karman's plan kind of ran out of gas in '62. And they went through, the whole plan, which was a brilliant plan, never mentioned the word computer, 1946.
Yeah.
So Sheila put together a study run by the Scientific Advisory Board of all the areas of science and technology of impact to the Air Force. And I ran the one on information, on the computer science part, not the information applications, which was a separate volume. But so I had people like Bob Luckey on my committee, Paul Sappho, Geo Wiederhold, a variety of very good people. And that was a very useful study. It became the framework for the Air Force spending money in that area for years.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ed. If people watching this are anything like me, we won't be able to wait 2 weeks like I'll have to wait to see the next episode. But we've got, all the dates filled in now in the framework, and next time we're going to go in and put lots of threads into this warp and weft here that we've got. So thanks very much for this first half.